All right, we're seeing a few attendees still joining, but I think we can kick off today's webinar. So I would like to welcome to our webinar today, introducing our new action partner, Quizrr, a Swedish startup providing awareness trainings for suppliers worldwide, building capacity, taking action. And I have with me Leanne Melnyk, Head of Impact and Partnerships. A few logistical points before we get started. The webinar will be recorded and we will share the recording as well as the slides afterwards with all registered participants. We have the Q&A section available in Zoom that you can use also during the webinar to ask questions. We'll keep an eye on it and also try and answer your question either at the end or during the webinar when it makes sense. The webinar will be structured in 4 parts. We'll start off with a short, brief introduction on the Prewave Action Platform, and then Leanne will tell us about Quizrr, who they are, what projects they do, some use cases. Then we will look into Quizrr on the Prewave Action Platform, more specifically, how can Prewave customers and users now use Quizrr through the Prewave Action Platform, and then end with a Q&A. So to get started, before Leanne takes over, introduces Quizrr, I give you a few slides on the Prewave Action Platform. So what is the Prewave Action Platform? It is a way to combine partners that are experts and specialists in various areas of taking actions and improving capacity and maturity at suppliers through audits, through supplier engagement, but also through awareness trainings, a way for all of the various Prewave customers to take action with their risk suppliers and improve them in a way that is in line with the requirements of the various due diligence laws that are now either coming out soon or already passed and live, such as the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, the Norwegian Transparency Act, or the European Union Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So it's all about taking suppliers from a risk supplier where we maybe identify a certain human rights related risk or a health and safety related risk, and then taking actions like a Quizrr awareness training that then integrates back into the Prewave scorecard to improve those suppliers. That means we can basically work with risk suppliers in a risk-based manner, focus our attention in a funnel approach with actions that are, let's say, higher intensity towards the end of the funnel, where we would then employ things like awareness trainings, desk audits, and also on-site audits. And that's, let's say, also where Quizrr comes in. Now, the benefits of the action platform are a few. The benefits are that it allows customers to seamlessly take action on risk suppliers with specialized vetted partners like Quizrr without contracting with each partner individually. And it will also allow customers in the future to take actions in a coordinated way if they share a risk supplier among them. But that is the outlook. But that was the brief introduction on the Prewave Action Platform. And with that, I hand it over to our guest today, which is Leanne Melnyk. Leanne, glad to have you here, and tell us a bit about yourself and also who is Quizrr and what do you do?
Great, thanks, Harald, for that introduction. So my name is Leanne Melnyk. I'm the head of Impact and Partnerships at Quizrr. So we are a Swedish edtech company, and I'm just going to bring up my slides here. So we're a Swedish edtech company that focuses on empowering workers in global supply chains. So we were actually born out of the Rana Plaza tragedy. So our 2 founders, Sophie and Jens, are actually working in Bangladesh at the time of that factory collapse. And it was a really good example, I think, of how if we are not empowering the that bottom half of the supply chains of those 450 million workers in global supply chains, then we're really not we're not preventing these tragedies from occurring. So in the case of Rana Plaza, workers had identified those cracks before the collapse, but they weren't empowered to really take action on that. And so they really saw that as being an opportunity for us to change that status quo and to really shift those power imbalances that exist along the supply chain. And so we started thinking through how can we empower workers in a way that is both effective, but also scalable. So we've to date, like sort of 10 years on, we've done almost 2 million learning sessions. We've trained over 500,000, just under 500,000 workers. And we actually work with workers all around the globe. So we've worked with sites in many different countries. We've worked with around 65 different nationalities and have training materials in over 30 languages. And so what we're going to be presenting today is how this idea of taking a scalable and effective approach to engaging workers in global supply chains and helping them to understand their rights in regards to decent work, how that fits in with Prewave, with this whole idea of risk and that wider concept of human rights due diligence. So we work with companies across different sectors. So that's the first one here, is that we really see that there's huge benefits in taking some of those leading companies and looking at how they can collaborate across sectors to train not only workers, but other members of the supply chain that have influence. So we've been working with companies in the ICT sector, in manufacturing, apparel, and increasingly actually going into other sectors like logistics as well. And the idea here is that human rights are industry agnostic, and that there's a lot of lessons learned that can be done if we actually take those industry leaders and bring them together. So this just shows you how what we call mitosis, or the scalability element of our trainings take place. Whenever we go into a workplace, we actually aim to train 100% of the management and 100% of the workers. And that again is really to ensure that we have equal knowledge that equals out the playing field. And so what we do is we start with our lead companies, which would be our direct clients. They would cascade the training, or sorry, our team would go in and provide the training to the sites. And then the site managers would take the training and also provide the QR codes to workers. And that's how every single one of these parties along that supply chain walks away with an equal set of knowledge. So why worker engagement and training? It's really interesting if you look, for example, at what the different legislation is saying on the idea of training and worker engagement. It's something that is, it's not new, but I think it's only recent that it's becoming more of an expectation rather than an exception in the human rights due diligence space. So when I started working in this space, back in, I guess it was 2016, the focus was very much on audits. And, you go in, you audit, you finish, and that was your annual cycle for ensuring a responsible supply chain. And it really wasn't taking into account those 450 million workers in global supply chains. And what we're seeing from the data, if we sort of break down that figure further, is that a lot of these workers are young. If we take India, for example, around 90% of them are within that 18 to 30-year-old, 29-year-old age range, predominantly female in many sectors. That changes if you look at something like logistics. But in many cases, especially if you look at that young female population, this is their first entryway into formal employment. And quite honestly, it's their only part in formal employment. Most of those women then leave after they reach childbearing age and have a family. And so we have a huge opportunity here to actually influence the course of these people's lives. So there's huge opportunities here, not just from a responsible sourcing perspective, but also really about, thinking more broadly about the SDG goals and how we can actually change people's lives. If we look at the legislation as being a key driver, over the past 10 years, we've actually seen an 800% increase in different types of legislation coming out. And the interesting thing about that legislation is that it's increasing not just in terms of the number of pieces of legislation that's coming out, but also about the coverage. So we've seen that, for example, with the Norwegian Transparency Act, which mandates that much deeper sort of deep dive into sort of beyond tier 1. And we're also seeing the expectations within that legislation rise. So we'll dive into that in a minute. And then looking just at the sort of scale of the issue, I think you've probably noticed in the news lately that we're seeing huge sort of social issues coming out, both as a result of the pandemic, but also as a result of conflict that we're seeing around the world. So in terms of how worker education fits into corporate due diligence, I think lots of times if you're in a company, you may see the value in training suppliers, but what is the business case for training workers? Well, I think there's a few things that sort of warrant that focus on bottom-up participation or that focus on workers. And the first one is really about thinking long-term. If you're going to go beyond tier 1, it's not possible to audit every single part of the supply chain. We need to see how we can ensure that workers actually know and understand their rights, and that they're able to identify and report violations when they occur. And so that's this whole focus on grievance that we've seen coming out. And so this is really about ensuring that you are building the capacity of workers in your value chain to be able to actually be agents of their own sort of identification of vulnerabilities and addressing them. It's also really about building that relationship with your supply chain. So in one aspect, you need to know everything about your supply chain, and a key part of that is knowing your workforce. So you need to have some sort of up-to-date data on the demographics in your supply chain. But it's also about building that relationship with lower tier suppliers as well. And that's one thing that we've seen companies really struggle with, is building that leverage in their lower tiers, and also building that trust with their immediate suppliers and other suppliers, simply because most of what's happened to date has been this sort of top-down policing approach. So this gives you another entry point and allows you to come in and build those relationships in a much healthier and a much more trust-based manner. And it's also about having that real-time analytics coming in from the workers directly, instead of always relying on intermediaries. It's really about maybe I'm not saying that word, disintermediating the supply chain and allowing those direct insights to flow to you. All right. So in terms of what the legislation says, I think it's super fascinating when you look at these different pieces of legislation that is coming out from Europe. And what we're seeing is that there's, everyone is using the OECD guidelines as a base. I think some more so than others. Definitely the Norwegian Transparency Act is the one that sort of references and relies on them most heavily. And so the Norwegian one, we do, however, see this very, very sort of explicit mention of the need for stakeholder engagement. Lots of people don't really understand what that means. Like, what does that term mean, right? It could mean because everyone can be a potential stakeholder. So do we go out and do we consult the world? Is that what they're asking for here? Well, no, actually, there's pretty good materials out there from OECD, but also from the legislators about who we mean by stakeholders. And definitely workers are identified as one of those key stakeholder groups. Why? Because they're the ones that are usually most impacted by violations or harms of human rights when they do occur. And so this is really about how are you engaging with workers in your supply chain. There's, interestingly enough, there's not a mention directly of training in the Norwegian Transparency Act. But again, since it refers back to the OECD guidelines, it does have this very strong mention on prevention and mitigation, of which training and capacity building is a key part. If we look at the EU legislation, that is obviously not passed yet, but for which we have the 3 final versions that will lead into our, hopefully, the final legislation. What we see here is that there was a really interesting, I guess, occurrence or discussion that happened between the Parliament and the European Commission around this notion of stakeholder engagement. So if we look at the EC version that came out, I think it was back in February, that version did not mention stakeholder engagement. And interestingly, when it went back to the Parliament, and that version came out just, I think, in June of this year, there was a new clause that was added, which mentions meaningful and two-way stakeholder engagement. And that shows you, and that was included at the request of a lot of different civil society organizations, worker rights organizations. And it just shows you the importance of this aspect, particularly for civil society in Europe. Why is that important? Well, those are the entities that are submitting the complaints against companies. So it's very, very smart to look not only what the legislation says explicitly, but what are NGOs, civil society, trade unions asking for, and what are they starting to submit some of these complaints on to make sure that you can avoid being subject to those complaints in the future. And then finally, just to end off, the German Supply Chain Act does not mention stakeholder engagement, but does have a very strong emphasis on training, prevention, and mitigation. Okay, so going into sort of what it is we do exactly, and what are the different types of trainings that are available. So we usually deploy to workers through an app, through your mobile phone. We recognize that not everywhere are there mobile phones, and so we do also offer a tablet version. We tend to use that in places like agriculture, where workers may not have access to smartphones or may not be as tech savvy to be able to download it through the QR code version way. But on the left, you see the app, which is how workers and management would access the training. And then on the right, you see our dashboard, which is where we generate all the amazing insights that can help to inform your due diligence strategy as a company. So how does it work? Well, workers would go in. So this shows workers that are actually doing the tablet version of the training. I believe these are workers in Mexico. And they would go in, and we always, through our methodology, we always have a combination of live action films. And that's really for the recognition factor, to make sure workers are seeing people that look like them, having discussions in a scenario that they could see themselves being in. And then we ask quiz questions. It's all gamified so that it engages the workers. And then we have little infographics in between. And this is really to make sure that we are ensuring that knowledge goes from, that it's knowledge gain followed by behavioral change, and making sure it's not just, we take the training and then, knowledge goes in and out the other ear. This is really about how we generate change within the supply chain. And then we also have a way, and just to mention that the training is always in workers' own language. So as we said, we have those 33 different languages, and it's really about reaching workers in a language that they understand. We also have like offline, online versions, audio support in case people are not literate. And then we also, as I said, that whole notion of feedback and engagement is very important, not just for the legislation, but also ensuring that workers and management are kept engaged through the process. So we do ask instant feedback questions. And the results of these can really help to feed into impact measurement about what sort of impact we think that training may be happening on these workers and the management. So we asked, do you feel you have more knowledge about your rights and responsibilities? Do you know better how to report or manage rights violations? That's one issue that we really see coming out in the training, is that a lot of people, they know about the issues, but they don't know what to do if a violation occurs. We also ask, do you plan to share what you've learned from this training with others, like family or friends or colleagues? And then also, did you enjoy the training? So were you engaged during that process? These are the different sort of big modules that we have. Within each one of these modules, there are around 3 to 4 mini modules on different topics. So for example, for our forced labor one, which is called ethical employment, we have that specific focus on recruitment practices, others on management systems and policies, and same thing on equality, safety, and respect. So under each one of these, you'd have a lot of other topics. In terms of where we work, this just shows sort of across the globe where we are. And in a lot of these places, we do also have team members that are based that often help with the deployment if it's not done through a sort of more automated manner. And then finally, just in terms of like, how are different people using this? We usually see across the board, I'd say three big sort of use cases. The first one is really about using this to prevent violations from occurring. So a really good example of this is VF's Your Voice Matters program. And this program we developed in collaboration with VF Corp, which is an American apparel company. And they've trained around 32,000 workers, predominantly migrant workers from across 20 different nationalities. And what they're doing is they've identified this vulnerable population, and they actually go in and say, okay, well, we know that this is a vulnerable population, and we're going to ensure that they understand their rights and responsibilities, particularly around this topic of forced labor. So making sure that they understand their rights and that they can exercise that. We've also done a lot of work in this area of responsible recruitment with labor agents as well. So training some of those other parts of the supply chain that may have the potential for both positive and negative impact on workers, and being able to sort of reach them and train them before rights violations occur. The second one is around codes of conduct and ensuring that workers are educated about codes of conduct in the supply chain. And then the third one is really around using this training as a way to ensure remediation after rights violations have occurred. We also have a partnership with Alula, and we do a lot of work around grievance as well. In terms of impacts that we see coming out at the end, we have some great statistics that have been done that make that link between prevention and capacity building, and then ending up with better compliance scores at the end. So we worked with some facilities, and in the end, they ended up with a 44% improved score on their BSCI audit. We've also done some work with academics that show that there's a 7% productivity increase after the training, and that there's on average a 94% worker satisfaction with the training.
Great. So you guys are really engaging workers globally and training workers globally. First of all, is it workers or also the management who's being trained by Quizrr?
So our primary audience is always workers, but as I said, it's really about equalizing the power imbalances, and it's very important to recognize that you can train workers, but if you are not influencing their managers, then you're probably not creating too much of a difference. Why? Because workers can understand their rights, but if they have no way to exercise them, then it doesn't lead to real change. And so that's why, even though our training is designed primarily for workers, we always train management as well.
Great. And I mean, so you're really working globally, and I think this is one of your key USPs, is that you are where the risks are, and that you are not just in Europe and North America, but you are in South America and in Southeast Asia. And this is where suppliers need to be engaged. Out of that work, like what are some of the trends, but also interesting data points you're seeing about maybe countries at risk, demographics at risk, industries at risk? Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think one of the big trends that we're seeing is a much wider sort of, or much companies are much more willing to collaborate with one another now on areas around capacity building and training. So I think that there's a recognition that if we're able to pool together our resources, we're able to reach it. We're able to have much wider reach than just sort of going out alone. So for example, right now, or we just recently finished a program with the Disney Skip program, where we together with brands across from different sectors, we built and then rolled out different training materials with labor agents, with migrant workers. And it was just phenomenal to see sort of that collaboration that we're seeing between some of these different leading companies. In the same way, we're just starting to do capacity building with suppliers in Mexico, and looking at how we can bring together different fast-moving consumer goods companies to train suppliers as a whole, and bringing in suppliers to speak with different suppliers. So I think this aspect of collaboration is a really important one to tell. And I think it's happening in part because as companies are being asked to do more, they don't have the resources to do everything everywhere. So there was a really good saying called, don't boil the ocean. And I think that's really about taking a risk-based and a prioritization approach to addressing human rights risks where they are the most salient, and where you do have those big pockets of risk, finding others that are also in that space so that you can pool those different resources together, but also increase your leverage. And I think that the whole notion of leverage is a really important one, particularly if we look at beyond tier one, or we look at those peripheral actors like labor agents, who are much more willing to act if they have multiple companies that are telling them the same thing. And so I think this whole sort of idea of collaboration is a really important one.
And that's actually one of the reasons why we founded this action platform, because we're seeing oftentimes risk suppliers that are serving several of our customers, and there is, let's say, the need to cooperate. It's even in the European Due Diligence Act and the German one, there is actually specifically mentioned industry cooperation and cooperation between companies to increase leverage. So I think your point is extremely valid and important. Yeah.
I was just going to say, Harald, real quick, one of the other interesting things is how is that is starting to expand into the tech space as well. Yeah. I was recently at a conference. It was a small conference, but there was a lot of bigger companies there who were testing a lot of these tech tools. And I remember one of them said, right now the tech world in this responsible sourcing space is like a Frankenstein. And they said, it's the elephant's head on the, giraffe's body. And I think that's really what we're trying to do here with the Prewave Quizrr collaboration, and with the wider collaborations that you have with other companies as well, is figuring out how we can sort of replicate that same idea of collaboration, scale, and impact that we're starting to see between companies in the tech space as well. But sort of going back to your question on data and what does the data tell us, I'm just going to skip ahead to this next slide. And I think one of the interesting trends that we're seeing from the data is that different groups have different sort of risk areas, and that the level of knowledge between the different parts of the supply chain varies quite rapidly. And so what we see is that if we take the difference, for example, just between workers that workers is not a homogenous group, that within that sort of concept of workers, there's these huge differences. We see differences between migrant workers and local workers. I want to do a deeper dive into the data too, because I suspect that there would be a really big difference between temp and agency and contract workers versus those that are sort of direct full-time employees of a particular facility. And so what we see is that migrant workers on average have a much lower awareness than local workers, and that gap widens to like around 16% in some geographies. And so we see that even though workers in general have a lower level of awareness, that migrant population in particular, walks in with a much lower understanding on these issues. And then if we look at the difference between workers and managers, if we take Malaysia as our use case, workers have a 17% lower understanding than managers on key areas like responsible recruitment. And that gap actually widens to 42% if we just look at Nepalese migrant workers. And so what we're seeing here is that, there's been so much focus on let's train the suppliers. And then when we train the suppliers, that knowledge will trickle down to the workers. But we're seeing is that the trickle down is not happening. That likely what happens is, they go to supplier training, they listen, they maybe share that knowledge with a few of their other management around them, but that knowledge is not being given to workers, and it's definitely not being given to those workers that are sort of the most vulnerable in terms of language and protection under the law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, super interesting. And yeah, tell us how it works. Yeah, because I think you've trained close to 500,000 workers now, which is absolutely amazing. So I suppose you have a lot of experience and also lessons learned out of engaging with that many workers in various countries. So yeah, tell us how now the Quizrr approach works, and tell us some lessons learned out of that.
So I think that this is really about aligning with the whole sort of OECD 6-step process of human rights due diligence. And so usually what happens is a company will come to us and they will have already done some sort of risk mapping of the different parts of their supply chain. So what we see is that the risk is not sort of equal across the board. There's obviously much higher risks in certain areas. So, Mexico, Guatemala, for instance, Bangladesh, those are probably your key sort of high-risk countries for things like freedom of association and collective bargaining. Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, these have very high concerns around equality, safety, and respect. And so the very first step is really to look at where you're sourcing from and to identify what some of those different risk areas are. Looking at it not just from like a country perspective, but also from the demographics of workers that are in that supply chain. So that's the very first step, is doing that training needs assessment. And so we do have a diagnostic tool that can go in there and identify which training is best suited for that particular workplace. Otherwise, if that process has already been done, we can just go in and sort of choose the training that they want to do. But one thing to note is that that training is accessible. You can mix and match. There's no sort of one set formula for how people select that training. But the idea is that you would have that really match the risk. And then as a next step, they'd go in, select the supplier in the different markets. And Quizrr would do a engagement with the suppliers. That's really important because you can't obviously just the suppliers really need to understand what this is about, and it's really about putting them at ease with doing the training. And then through a purely sort of automated process, we do a baseline survey. So that baseline survey is actually built into workers taking the training. So as they're taking the training, the first step is they complete a mini baseline. And that baseline just takes a few minutes to do. And then they would go in and do the actual training. So again, that would be both workers and managers that do that training. Could be individually, could be in groups. And then afterwards, they would go in and they would want to do a refresher training. That refresher training piece is really important because we see that workforces change quite frequently. So usually our clients would do refresher training maybe once a year, but you could also do it once every 6 months. And then from that, at the end of that process, that's when you get to see all of the great data on the dashboard. And you get to go in and see who are the workers in my supply chain, where are the different areas that they're struggling on, where have they scored strongly. And then that's when you get to have some good conversations with your suppliers about improving in different areas. So that's the main flow of it. And then in terms of the different types of training that we have with Prewave in particular. So we're going to be offering 3 trainings on the Prewave platform. So the first one here is on social compliance. So this one is a rights-based training that touches on all of those key rights. So it's really sort of let's say a compilation of some of those other different trainings that we have on the fundamental rights. So it addresses occupational safety and health, addresses forced labor. There's a smattering of different ones in there on social compliance. And then we have our ethical employment or forced labor training. So that one is really good, both for local workers as well as for migrant workers. And then we have our training on occupational safety and health as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we dive a little bit deeper into the different topics that are covered by these trainings, I'm not going to read them all out because I think that would probably be boring for you guys. But just to say that we do base our forced labor module off the ILO core conventions, the ILO fair recruitment guidelines. So we always work very closely with the international standards when developing our training. And again, it always does have that, you'll see here the live action film on the left. We actually go to those locations and we do filming with real actors to replicate scenarios that workers may find themselves in. And in most of these trainings, you'll see on the right, we do have an aspect of grievance that is being built into them so that it helps them to understand not only what is best practice on the topics, but also what does the local law say on these topics? And then how can workers actually raise and have these violations be remediated if a rights violation has occurred? And then we also have our, oops, sorry, this one's also on our forced labor practices. Sorry, I got those mixed up. So this is our social compliance one. So this one is the one that, as I said, touches on forced labor. It touches on occupational safety and health, fire and building safety. This one is our responsible recruitment one that touches again on forced labor, but also aspects like workplace policies and workplace dialogue. We also have our training on occupational safety and health. And this one does cover some of those key topics like building and fire safety. So maybe I will pause there, and I would love to see sort of how this looks in the platform and hear more about what you guys have been doing on your side at Prewave.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and thanks for showing. So these 3 trainings, we selected them because they most closely fit also the broad requirements of the law. You guys are working on the environmental training. We would love to have that in the future as well. I think that's a great addition. So yeah, let me take over and show you how this now looks like in practice on the Prewave platform. So in the Prewave platform, we are now starting with September, offering a new section that is showing the various services and action providers that we now have. TÜV Süd offering audits, but if we filter now on awareness trainings, we see now 2 out of the 3 that Leanne just showed set up here for this demo. Customers can then decide whether they want to use these trainings. Enabling or disabling means then that they will be recommended for risk suppliers. Yeah? So let's say we have the social compliance awareness training now activated. If we come out of the risk assessment, which is giving us an overview of our suppliers with risk, but also where we have leverage. Yeah, these would be the suppliers in the top right. That would then lead us into the action planning module, which ranks our suppliers based on the action priority. So precisely this combination of the level of risk we see with the supplier that we can also assess in various areas. For instance, here a steel mill in Germany with an elevated profile around health and safety risks. Or maybe here a steel mill in the Netherlands with also previous issues where we've already engaged also with a few actions, but maybe they have not, let's say, had the required or desired impact. So then the platform recommends more actions, in this case, either a desk audit or an awareness training. And the neat thing now about the action platform is that I can now engage these trainings and other services directly off the platform. So here I'm being now recommended the Quizrr social compliance training that I can then plan with my supplier. And as I'm planning that action, I can then also neatly execute it straight out of the platform, which would then trigger the process between Prewave and Quizrr to approach the supplier and to actually get the training done. Of course, always keeping you, the customer, in the loop as well. And at the end of the day, once the training is complete, we return the results into the Prewave scorecard. These would then be added to the assessment score component of the score, where we see now that this supplier has now completed a human rights-based training, which is the social compliance training, affecting some of the human rights components of the scorecard. And we will then also be able to link out to either basic results of the training, but also potentially to the Quizrr platform itself, where customers can dig in depth on the various reportings that also Quizrr provides. So let's say the Prewave integrated solution could mean that we might be able to skip over some of the initial assessments that Quizrr is typically providing, and we can jump straight into the baseline survey or the Quizrr training in a more targeted approach, because we have already done the risk assessment through Prewave. And with that, we are at the end of our webinar, and I also see that we've already received a few questions. First question to you, Leanne. Is Quizrr just an app or available on a tablet, or is it also usable through basically a laptop on a website? I guess this is now for the workers on how they engage with the training material.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is primarily app-based, but the dashboard is desktop-based. So it's it does though work on a tablet as well. So those are the two primary ways by which people use it. We have seen you know, it really, and the preferences really depend on the audience. So for example, and also the location. We've seen in Southeast Asia that workers love to take the training on their phones. They like each get given a little space in the workplace and they sit down with their phone, and you can see them really enjoying it individually. In Mexico, we've seen the workers really want to take it on a tablet together. They really enjoy being together and having those conversations as they work through it. And then the management, obviously, you know, it's sort of a much more mixed bag there. But we do try to make it as yeah, you can see it. Also, you can access it through a phone, through a desktop, through a link as well. So I have watched the different videos and done some of the trainings through desktop as well. So there's different ways, and we really try to have that be a part of the approach, is to make it as flexible as possible to meet different scenarios. So we're doing some really interesting work right now, actually, in agriculture, looking at deploying in agriculture where there's like 15% literacy rate of workers and no internet. So it's just across the board in terms of where we deploy. So we try to have as many ways to reach the training as possible.
And from the perspective now of maybe this Mexican worker, what type of content am I actually getting from Quizrr? Maybe go into that a little bit, because I think you guys also really have a USP there with the content of the learning material. And also, how long does it take typically for a worker to complete a session of training? Would be interesting to understand that.
Yeah, so in terms of the content, we've actually just started expanding also into soft skills. And so the idea there is to also allow workers a little bit of a choice in some aspect of what they want to watch, and to branch into other areas like leadership, health and hygiene, you know, some of these different areas, soft skills training as well. So it's really about both training on social and labor, but as you said, we're trying to branch into environmental as well right now, as well as some of those other trainings to ensure that workers also have a choice in what they're able to watch. And then, sorry, what was your second question again?
Yeah, how long does it take for an individual worker to complete the session? Yeah.
So it normally takes around like 15 minutes per module. So they can break it up. That's the great thing about it, is that it you know, a lot of the concerns for suppliers, if you come to them and say, hey, we want to train your entire workforce, the first thing that pops into their head is, don't take away my workforce, because that is going to impede on my productivity. And so one of the things that we always say to suppliers in the onboarding process is that, look, this training, you know, it takes around like maybe 35-40 minutes to complete in total, but they can break that up into little bite-sized chunks. And so that's often what they'll do, is they'll take workers off the line for 15 minutes at a time, kind of spread over different periods, so that it's not substantially interrupting that production process. And that's also been, I think, one of the value adds that suppliers have seen, is that flexibility of deployment and the fact that it doesn't impede on their production time.
And if you take it now from the perspective of training the workers of a given supplier, how long does that take, you know, from beginning to end? Probably depends on a couple of factors, number of employees. Are there any other factors it depends on? But yeah, how does that typically work, and how long does it take typically?
Yeah, it really depends on sort of the willingness of the supplier. We've seen one supplier in India train 50,000 workers in just a matter of a few months. And so that's been sort of lightning speed. Same thing during the pandemic, we reached like 30,000 workers in 2 months. So it's, you know, it really depends. I'd say the average time is between like 3 to 6 months. And that's really, again, giving them this huge window to train workers in different batches. So what we do at the start is we sit down with the supplier, or they can just go in directly and choose their own sort of training plan. But we figure out a training plan that makes sense with them. And they will let us know how quickly they can complete it. So could be done even in like a day if people really wanted to. But lots of times suppliers, again, because they're concerned about taking huge groups of workers off the line, they choose to space it out and say, hey, I'm going to do 30 workers this month, or I'm going to do 50 workers the next month. And so they'll figure out what cadence works for them and move accordingly. But the great thing is that back in the dashboard, that training plan that's been decided, that shows in the dashboard. And it sort of, you get like a red dot if the training plan is not being followed. So if they're following behind, you will clearly see that. They will also see it. So it's, there's the right mechanisms in place to show if that training plan is not being followed.
Interesting. Another question we got was, are the digital learning programs scalable across different regions? Is it a very localized approach, or can data be compared between regions? And how is that possible?
Yeah, so what we do is we always start off with a module with a global base. So for example, if we take forced labor, there will be certain parts of that module that are based on international standards and best practice that cut across different geographies, right? Like the 10 ILO forced labor indicators are global. There's just, you can think about different adaptations of them, yes, in local context, but across the board, we have our 10 indicators and those don't change. We also have our international conventions. We have our guidance on fair recruitment. So these are the aspects that we're able to do across the board. And what we do is the films that we make are different interpretations of that same global base. So for example, we have very similar scripts between the different geographies, but with actors that look like the people from that local context and changing it into their language. And then we usually have a small bit at the end, which will reference local law. So for a good example of that is in our equality, safety, and respect training, we have a sort of fourth module that talks about the POSH Act in India. And so what we can do is we just take off that little bit that is sort of on that local law, and then we will replace it with something new in whatever new geography that we're in. So we find that works really, really well, is having that global base. And then we make these regional adaptations. Absolutely, it doesn't get very scalable if you really contextualize it and you can't reuse anything. But our approach has been to take international best practice, use that as the base, and then to add in parts that can easily be removed and replaced towards the end, which reference that sort of local context, which may be important for them to understand.
One other question that I think comes up a couple of times is, we talked about suppliers mostly, but has Quizrr been used and can it be used to also train my own operations, my own workforce? Is that something that you've done before?
Yeah, it's actually something that we're working on right now. So we're developing an HRDD training because we know that people struggle with understanding how to actually put the OECD framework into practice. And we have had some companies use the training, our existing training, to actually train members of their own operations. So it's an area that we're building on and expanding on right now. So the HRDD training is going into things like, how do I actually build a policy and embed it into my operations? Like, how do I undertake a risk assessment? So that training is really targeting internal compliance specialists and procurement teams and others that may know about the concept of human rights due diligence, but don't understand actually how to put it into practice. And so yeah, there's that one training that is focusing primarily on internal staff, and then some companies have definitely used the training to sensitize others in their team as well.
Cool. The last question we got was, I cannot imagine that the one size fits all of the training material can really work with impact, having a wide range of suppliers and different legislations. Can you speak to that? Is it really one size fits all?
No, and I think that's really our specialty, is making sure it's not one size fits all. There's a lot of other people offering training out there that are like global animations that don't change. Our training material, if you watch it, it's really it's very thoughtfully done. It does take into account that context. But as I said, it's finding that right balance between having that base, which is based on the international standards, and then giving people the right local context that they need to know to make sure that they understand how that fits into their local context. So maybe a good example of that is, right now we are building out a training with two of our clients on the labor law reform in Mexico. And so that training, what we're doing is, even though the primary focus is to educate management and workers on what that labor law reform is in Mexico, we're building out a sort of global base, which is on freedom of association and collective bargaining. And that global base is meant to be expandable to different geographies. And it touches on things like, what do the international standard, like what is freedom of association and collective bargaining in conventions 87 and 98? Breaking that down into bite-sized chunks for a worker to understand. What is like union interference? What is union discrimination? What are these different violations that can impede these rights? But then we have different parts of that module, which can then easily be sort of rebuilt for a new context, which go into things like, can you have multiple unions in one workplace? What does it mean when only one union can collectively bargain on behalf of these members? What does the law say about your right to unionize in Mexico? And so what does the law say to employers about when you're supposed to provide that collective bargaining agreement to the workers? And so again, it's really about having a piece of that training dive into some of that local context that will be helpful for suppliers and workers, but making sure that we have that global base to make it scalable. So we do feel like we give enough local context to make it really helpful to have people use this knowledge and translate it into behavioral change to have real impact on the ground.
Cool. Thanks, Leanne. I mean, maybe one last question, because I think you guys are a very impact-driven company, and you're the head of impact. So maybe last question, how do you measure impact at Quizrr, and what does impact mean to you at Quizrr? Yeah,
we're doing some fascinating work right now on impact evaluation. So we're part of the Working Capital group of companies. Dan Biederman is the head of that, and he used to be the head of Verite, and we together with, and Prewave is also part of Working Capital, and a part of sort of being part of this group means we have the opportunity to work with some of the impact specialists that are part of Working Capital. And so what we're doing right now is we're taking and it's called an evaluation panel approach to looking at how our training is translating into actual behavioral change. So we're looking at it from both sort of an activity and output perspective, looking at number of people being trained, looking at, and then looking a little bit more into those shorter term outcomes, like what has been the knowledge change between point A to point B. But then we're also looking at it from the perspective of longer term outcomes and impacts of looking at, do we see an increase in violations being reported, hopefully in the short term. And then as we see employers putting in better policies, better management systems into place, do we see compliance levels sort of going up and less violations sort of occurring over time? So we've built out a whole sort of impact framework around that. And we're working with academics and experts around the globe to help us to measure that with some of our bigger clients that are rolling out in different geographies. So would be happy to share more on that another time, but I think it's almost another, we need another webinar on that one, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, with that, I can only say thank you so much, Leanne, for joining us today, introducing Quizrr to, let's say, the Prewave audience and the Prewave customers. I think it's really exciting what you're doing, and even more exciting that we can now offer Quizrr also to Prewave customers. With that, I also say thank you to our audience. As mentioned at the beginning, we will share the recording of the webinar, as well as the contact details of both myself and Leanne. Feel free to reach out to us if you are interested in learning more. And yeah, Leanne, I thank you. And with that, I say goodbye and towards the next one.
Thank you for everyone for listening, and Harald for the invitation. Take care.
Bye.